Hi there guys, this is Max from Make It Conscious. I hope you're all doing well. I hope you are in a beautiful state today, because that is the topic of today's video. I'm going to be talking about habit 5, manage your state. And so now we're moving into the mental discipline section of the 7 habits. We've been through understanding, that's habits 1 and 2. We've moved through conduct, habits 3 and 4. And now habits 5, 6, and 7 are all associated with mental discipline. Mental discipline being of crucial importance because a lot of where we focus our energy, where we direct our consciousness, is mental. So this is an absolutely vital part of the path to individuation. So whilst mental discipline wasn't Jung's primary focus area, it is absolutely a focus area of pretty much every religion, I would say, and certainly most spiritual traditions. And it is absolutely vital on the path to individuation, simply because if we're not directing our mental focus, our consciousness, if we're not actively directing our consciousness, then individuation is very unlikely to happen. It's going to only happen via directed focused attention coming from the higher mind, the higher self. Now, according to Tony Robbins, managing one's state is the finest skill there is. I'm pretty sure I heard him say that at a seminar in 2017. He might not have used those exact words, but I can really see where he's coming from. It's certainly up there. It's a very fine skill. I think firstly, because it's not something that many people acknowledge they can actually do. Like consciously exerting the mind away from unwholesome and suffering states and towards wholesome and what we call beautiful states of mind. That's absolutely something we can do without any material, without any tools, just purely by the exertion of our minds. Secondly, it really is a skill. Like this is something you can practice. An analogy that I find useful here is that of a garden. If you imagine your mind is like a garden that needs cultivating. Now, in a typical garden, you might have hopefully a lot of fruits and vegetables. You might think of these as beautiful states and wholesome states. And then you might have a lot of weeds and thorns, and they might be suffering states and unwholesome states. Now, what we do in the garden is we cultivate it. We work to pull out the weeds and the thorns, and we plant and cultivate the fruits and the vegetables. Another way in which this is quite helpful, I think, is to remember that even though we might say, I'm growing tomatoes, we're not really, right? Tomatoes grow themselves. We merely provide the conditions. This habit acknowledges that the mind is like a garden and you can cultivate it and you can apply energy in certain ways to give momentum to certain states of mind. And likewise, we apply energy to reduce the momentum and eventually eliminate certain states of mind as well. So the kind of mind states we're dealing with here, we refer to as beautiful and wholesome states, and then suffering and unwholesome states. And we stay clear of saying things like positive states, because that is more of a polarity. That's more like saying, in opposite to positive, there's negative. And actually, we don't really consider that any emotion is negative or positive. Emotions are all there for a reason. Everything exists for a reason. Everything has its own purpose in a way. But what I find more accurate is to say beautiful state, because that is where we're moving to. This isn't necessarily just a state of happiness. It really depends how you want to define happiness. I think it's broadly quite an accurate word to describe a beautiful state. But happiness might, to some people at least, suggest something that's conditioned and more in polarity to unhappiness or sadness. So a beautiful state of mind is really more one that's coming from the true self, more from an unconditioned state of mind that isn't in conflict. And so what we're talking about here is moving towards a whole state of mind, a mind that isn't torn every which way, which doesn't have all these desires and aversions that it can't decide between. It's a mind that is unified and whole, and therefore it naturally comes to a beautiful state of mind because it's not being dragged in all these different directions. It's existing in harmony with the world around it and its own experience. On the other hand, unwholesome states of mind would be conducive to suffering, right? Because it's pulling us to a place where we're not whole, and therefore we're looking to the world to give us what we think we need and push other aspects away that we've disidentified from. So it's just a little piece there on the nomenclature that we use. We're talking about beautiful states and suffering states, wholesome states and unwholesome states. So wholesome states of mind would be things like joy, peace, happiness, we can call that a wholesome state of mind, tranquility, concentration, equanimity, compassion, love, whereas unwholesome states of mind would be things like anger, sadness, envy, laziness, restlessness, guilt, shame, fear. So there's a preponderance of terms on each side, but just a few examples there of what we might consider a beautiful state of mind and a suffering state of mind or an unwholesome state of mind. So like with all 7 habits in this series, habit 5 also has 3 key facets associated with it, which can help guide our practice in a bit more detail. In summary, first of all, those 3 are 1, proactive, so using energy to manage our state proactively. That means going forward to make the unconscious conscious, to deal with things that we know we need to deal with, and to put energy into cultivating and maintaining wholesome states. The second would be responsively. This is acting in the moment to whatever happens to be arising. And again, this works in the sense of either eliminating unwholesome states or cultivating wholesome states. So the third is constructively. Now this is where we use energy to configure our external world in a way that is conducive to a wholesome state of mind. So first facet, let's talk about how we apply habit 5 proactively. So this is when we know there's something in the mind we need to deal with. We know there's an issue that has to be dealt with at some point, which might actually compound if we don't. And we're in conflict because even though we might not be suffering from that issue right now, we know that it's something that has to be done and therefore it will arise under certain conditions. So part of our mind knows, the higher self knows that this is something that has to be encountered at some point and it wants to move forward. But there's also another part of the mind, the ego perhaps, that doesn't want to move forward. It knows that there's a pain, there's a feeling associated with whatever is hiding in the mind. And so it is trying to protect itself. It is using feeling as a guide to say, don't want to go there, this is bad. So this could be like a little job we have to do, maybe a conversation that needs to be had at some point. So someone who is practicing habit 5 proactively is going to be taking proactive steps to move towards making the unconscious conscious and doing what they need to do for the sake of their mind. The opposite of this, because sometimes it can help to think of the opposite as a way to illustrate the point more clearly. The opposite of being proactive here is not merely being reactive or passive. It's like when you know there's just something to do and there's something to say, like maybe it's a relationship that you've been in for a long time and there's something that's unresolved in that relationship and like neither of you want to go there because it's just too painful. That would be the opposite of practicing habit 5 proactively. Now, of course, this is not always easy. In fact, it's generally a challenge. That's why it is habit 5 and requires energy, right? It's something that requires active use of mental energy to pursue. And it doesn't mean we have to be revolving our lives around constantly doing nothing but going out there and proactively solving challenges. You're not failing if you're not doing this. It's just a guide to say that this is part of the practice, and when the time is right, insofar as you have the mental energy to do so, and the world presents that opportunity, because it will if you cultivate wholesome intentions and you bear in mind that there's going to be some proactive use of energy here, the opportunity will arise. We still have to be doing things at the right time, but we also don't want to let the ego work its way in to convince us that this is something we best just not deal with. This first facet, proactive, this very much also works in the positive sense in that we apply energy to cultivate wholesome and beautiful mind states. What we can do in this kind of situation is we can actually be proactive to cultivate states like loving kindness. So we can actually therefore go and say talk to a stranger or talk to 5 strangers, like, why stop at 1? So what we're doing here is we're actually being proactive to bring about wholesome mind states. Now, if there was no resistance, then there wouldn't be any energy required to do so. So almost by definition, when we practice habit 5, we're dealing with a bit of resistance because we are applying energy to cultivate beautiful and wholesome states of mind and to abandon suffering states of mind and unwholesome states of mind. This is also where we start thinking about breaking patterns, doing things that are outside our comfort zone, because the only reason we have a comfort zone is because there's resistance, right? Because there is a feeling associated which keeps us inside a certain bubble, a certain idea of ourselves, an ego idea. For those of you who've known me for a few years, you might remember a video I recorded back in 2017 where I decided to lie on the floor in the middle of the Berlin Christmas market for about 30 seconds, which is a peculiar thing to do in most places around the world, not least in Germany, not least in the middle of a Christmas market. You know, it was no big deal, but it definitely caught some attention. But the only reason I did it was because there was a bit of resistance to doing it. So, you know, it's like, well, who am I trying to defend? What am I trying to be, right? What idea of myself am I trying to uphold here? Just lie on the floor for 30 seconds. It's not going to harm anyone. I'm only going to have a weaker sense of ego, hopefully, at the end of it. So it's things like this, you know, it's little challenges like that. The kind of thing that you don't see people doing very often, as long as it's not harm anyone, can be quite a good way to actually proactively manage one's mental state. This absolutely is part of the course for attaining to individuation. You know, part of it is to break free of societal norms, because societal norms want you to conform and meet specification and be that well-behaved cog in the machine. So there's a curious relationship between individuation and ethics, and I talked about that in the previous videos, habits 3 and 4, of course. But really, individuation is about integrating the opposites. It's about, yes, making decisions based on logic and compassion, but bringing those two things together, not overly relying on one, not overly relying on what is merely expected of you, but not throwing that completely out of the window either, because there may actually be some value in that. So what it's really about is not just listening to one facet of consciousness, but bringing in the opposites. And that is how the higher self, the true self, is actually able to operate in a harmonious way. That is it in a nutshell, because what we're experiencing is the self, really. So if we can make it conscious and integrate the opposites, we don't need to abide by some kind of societal or ethical code, but neither at the same time will that automatically turn us into a crazed lunatic or a raging eccentric. No, it's really about doing what is right as of the moment. The second facet of habit 5 is to be responsive. So here we are dealing with whatever is coming up in the moment and applying energy to do that. So this is where, for example, we let it go. Like if a unwholesome mind state has arisen, if a unwholesome thought or a suffering state of mind has arisen, we can let it go. We can do that by cutting it off. We can redirect our attention using energy to another object or to a wholesome state of mind. So there's really kind of 2 techniques embedded in that. The first is we can redirect our attention using energy, and it might take energy because this unwholesome state that has arisen might be really calling out our attention. It might have a lot of mental energy behind it, a lot of momentum basically. You know, it's something that has been cultivated in the past that the ego deems to be important perhaps, but if it's unwholesome and it's conducive to suffering, we can engage the higher mind and apply energy to divert our attention. Some simple ways we can do this. Well, the first way might just be to say during meditation, we might redirect our focus to the breath. That is kind of the bread and butter of meditation. And so that's essentially what we're doing there, is we're practicing habit 5 to manage our state. We are acting in response to what is happening in the moment. And in doing so, we are cultivating our mental garden, right? We are kicking out unwholesome mind states. And over time, they start to lose energy because we've redirected our focus elsewhere. Another way to do this is, say if we're walking around town, we can redirect our attention to the sensation on the sole of our feet as we walk, or to simply the sounds, whatever's happening right now. It can help to have a kind of go-to object and to build that into your habit patterns, but it's not the only way to do it. Really, in essence, what we're doing here is just redirecting our energy because something unwholesome has arisen, and so we engage consciousness and redirect the energy, thus removing energy from the unwholesome mind state. There's another technique we can use here, which is what I call applying the antidote. So whatever unwholesome state has arisen, we can then think of what is the opposite of that state, and we can apply a kind of antidote. So for example, if anger has arisen, we can redirect the anger, sure, but then we actually go one step further. We can apply love. We can apply and practice loving kindness as an antidote to anger, because it is impossible to be angry and loving at the same time. A simple way of doing this, again, is just to practice loving kindness in daily life. It might be, if, say, we're walking around town, we can just wish people well. We can look at people coming the other way, not so intently that we freak them out, but just enough that we can mentally connect and empathize perhaps and see what they might be going through. And we can just maybe say in our head something like, may you be well. I find that very effective. And so this is a way of practicing loving kindness as an antidote to anger. Likewise, if we're feeling especially run down or a little bit lethargic, we can apply energy, we can exert energy mentally to act as an antidote to that lethargy. There's a concept that can help us here, which I call find a bigger lever. And this is simply when, if what we're doing isn't quite shifting it, if it's not giving it quite enough energy to abandon that unwholesome mind state, we can find a bigger lever, we can do the next biggest thing to see if we can't shift whatever it is that's going on. So as an example, say we are feeling lethargic, we can try exerting ourselves mentally. Say we're in a meditation, we can exert the mind during meditation, we can be conscious of the fact we're lethargic, we can make an attempt to make ourselves more alert. Let's say that doesn't work. What we can actually do, we can change positions, we can shift to a standing meditation, for example. And if that doesn't work, we can then switch to a walking meditation. So there's always something else we can do to exert the mind. And this concept of finding a bigger lever actually applies to all three facets, which we'll discuss today, not least to proactive. Let's say you have an addiction to chocolate, right? And your first attempt might be to, well, simply don't eat the chocolate. But then, that works a bit, but then there might still be chocolate in the cupboard that you bought before, and you think, eventually the conditioning kicks in and somehow you find yourself eating the chocolate. Well, okay, on this occasion, the mind was not strong enough to overpower that conditioned tendency to eat the chocolate. No problem. What you do is you find a bigger lever. Rather than simply not eat the chocolate, what you then do is you don't buy the chocolate, right? It's a lot easier to not eat it when it's not in the cupboard. So you found a bigger lever, you've got a bit more energy behind you now. Then let's say you're struggling to even not buy the chocolate. Like you're doing your shopping, you're going around the supermarket, and you just find yourself just reaching out and just somehow grabbing it. You look at it, you get that pleasant feeling of those thoughts of eating that chocolate, and you just can't cut it off, can't direct the attention away, ends up in your shopping basket, you end up buying it, taking it home. Okay, find a bigger lever. Don't go to that same shop. Right, there's always something you can do. Go to a different shop that doesn't sell chocolate. If that's not possible, you can order food online, you can order your shopping online, you can ask someone else to shop for you until you decondition that tendency just enough that you can then go back to that shop and do so without running the risk of buying the chocolate. So it's quite a banal example of that, but it just illustrates what we mean here by finding a bigger lever. And there's a point here, which is that the ego will try and find a reason, it will try and find an excuse, even when the higher mind knows that it's a wholesome choice that's conducive to a beautiful state of mind, and it wants to move in the direction of wholeness. And so at that point, we can find a bigger lever. That way we can get leverage with the self, and we can diminish the strength of the ego mind. The third facet of habit 5 is to manage your state constructively. Now, really what this is about is how we construct and organize our external world and circumstances in a way that is conducive to wholeness. Now, there's really a point at the heart of this, which is that if we attain to wholeness as much as we are working on our minds, is not exclusively a mental exercise, and of course that is implicit in all the habits that we've discussed, but that there is value in conditioning our external world in a way that is more effective at bringing about wholesomeness and wholesome states of mind. And so there's nothing wrong at all with living a good life, getting a good career that is financially rewarding and gratifying, and you're living in a sensible place that isn't dangerous, right? Isn't excessively priced, isn't excessively cheap. Right? So there is value in this. And so first it's helpful, I think, just to dispel maybe a slight myth that we just can just go and sit by the side of the Ganges and that'll be enough. I mean, that might be enough for some people, and that might well be an interesting thing to try for a little while. At the same time, there is a need to walk the middle way with this particular facet, because if we are just trying to take that conventional approach of just making everything as good as possible, as perfect as possible, of course, that's an approach that is doomed to failure, right? Because what we're dealing with is our own mind. And so if we're trying to configure our world to make it perfect so that we'll never have to be uncomfortable ever again, well, that's just completely not possible, because what we're experiencing is our mind, and the world is only a mere representation of it. So if we're only focusing on trying to make the world perfect, we're not actually working on our mind. But at the same time, if we completely neglect our external circumstances, then that's not actually working on the mind either, because in essence, by doing that, we are actually neglecting our mind by association. So there's absolutely a middle way to be found here. Now, habit 5, being part of the mental discipline section of the 7 habits, works very much in tandem with habit 6, which is mindfulness all day, every day, and habit 7, which is meditate daily. So in all 3 of these, we're applying mindfulness and we're applying habit 5 to manage our state. So when we apply mindfulness, which is present moment awareness, we then come in with habit 5 to then deal with whatever has arisen. So these 2 habits actually work together very closely, but there's a big difference, which is that mindfulness is about present moment awareness, whereas managing our state is about applying energy to deal with whatever's arisen in consciousness. Likewise with meditation, during meditation we are applying mindfulness because we're being aware in the present moment, and then we are applying habit 5 to redirect whatever's arisen again during meditation. I'm going to round off this video by talking about how, again, Jungian psychology can actually help us here, and specifically in regards to Jung's theory about personality types, which was later developed by Myers and Myers-Briggs to form the Myers-Briggs type indicator. So if you'll excuse me getting a slightly technical just for a minute or so, I think it will be useful either way. Whatever your personality type, there's going to be a particular kind of suffering state that you tend to go to, and it has to do with the balance between your introversion and extroversion. And again, if you excuse the technicality, but it's an underuse of, or an overuse rather, of your dominant function and an underuse of your auxiliary function. In summary, let me just summarize this very concisely. We each have a particular kind of loop that we can get stuck in, and a very effective go-to often to break us out of those kinds of loops is to move to what is often referred to as the auxiliary function. So just to give an example, say we are someone who likes to lead with thinking, introverted thinking, and then we might combine that with introverted sensing. So we might sort of be like collecting data, verifying it, collecting data, verifying it all inside our minds. We can get stuck in a very repetitive introverted loop doing that. An unparalleled way to break out of that for someone of that pattern is to engage their extroverted function, like their extroverted intuition, is to go out, is to explore novelty, is to go out and experience something new. And that is a surefire way to break that person out of that loop. So it really helps to know what your type is, and this is an area in which a coach can help with you. And this might give you a bit of a shortcut to know for your specific personality type what exactly is like to help in the 50, 60, 70% of situations where that is your kind of flavor of suffering, and give you a steer on exactly what kind of actions to take to break that particular pattern. And not only that, but why that particular action breaks that pattern for you. So that's another thing that a Jungian coach can help you with, and it's a very interesting and helpful area of discussion, I think, between a coach and their client. So I'm going to leave that there, guys. That was habit 5, manage your states. I hope that was useful. I shall chat to you next time.